Now, if you think running a marathon is tough, try doing it on Nexus Prime, a delightful little desert world where the temperature hits a balmy 52 degrees Celsius in the shade, assuming you can find any shade, which you can't, because the planet apparently never heard of trees. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Welcome to the Galactic Athletic Championship, where beings from across the galaxy gather to prove who's the toughest, fastest, and most capable of not dying horribly in 200 kilometers of pure, unadulterated misery. The betting pools were already open, and surprise, nobody was putting money on the human. Vaughn stood at the starting line, looking about as intimidating as a wet napkin next to the competition. While the Kuvathi pack stretched their impressive limbs and showed off canine teeth that could probably cut through starship hull plating, our human friend was quietly checking his bootlaces. Again, because apparently, that's what humans do when they're nervous. They fidget with perfectly functional equipment. "Look at the pink thing," growled Gortham, the Kuvathi Alpha, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from generations of pack leadership and probably eating things that disagreed with him. His silver-gray fur bristled in the desert heat, but his yellow eyes remained cold and calculating. "It barely reaches my shoulder. How did such a creature even qualify?" The other Kuvathi laughed, a sound somewhere between a bark and a chainsaw, having an argument with a garbage disposal. Young Velka, barely past cubhood, but trying desperately to keep up with the adults, managed a weak chuckle. His reddish-brown fur was already showing patches of nervous shedding, and his ears kept twitching at every sound. Poor kid was more anxious than a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. "Maybe it's here for comic relief," suggested another pack member, Korthak, whose idea of humor apparently peaked sometime during the Cretaceous period. Vaughn, bless his oblivious human heart, seemed entirely unaware of the trash talk happening 3 meters away. He was too busy studying his wrist device, not some fancy alien tech, mind you, just a basic environmental scanner that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and hope. His dark hair was already damp with sweat, and his pale skin was already showing the first signs of what would undoubtedly become a spectacular sunburn. The other competitors weren't much more impressed with humanity's representative. Kethal, the Nexari crystalline being, literally sparkled in the sunlight like some sort of geological disco ball, their translucent body refracting light in patterns that probably violated several physics laws. They communicated through harmonic vibrations that sounded like wind chimes having an existential crisis. The carbon-based biped appears structurally insufficient for prolonged exertion, Kethal chimed, their voice carrying the musical quality of someone who'd never experienced a single day of doubt in their perfectly symmetrical existence. Vorthix, one of the gas-breathing Fluxi, expelled a cloud of methane that served as either commentary or a nervous habit. Hard to tell with the Fluxi. They weren't exactly known for their social graces. His bulbous, translucent body rippled with internal organs that shifted like a lava lamp designed by someone with serious commitment issues. The race coordinator, Mulvek, a bureaucratic nightmare of a being whose species apparently evolved from filing cabinets, called for attention with a sound that could only be described as the mating call of a dying air conditioner. "Competitors," Mulvek announced through his translator, which somehow made his voice sound even more boring than it probably was naturally. The Galactic Athletic Championship covers 200 kilometers of Nexus Prime's most challenging terrain. You will face extreme temperatures, unstable ground, predatory wildlife, and environmental hazards designed to test the limits of biological endurance. Vaughn nodded along like he was receiving directions to the nearest grocery store. Meanwhile, every other competitor was flexing, posturing, or, in Kethal's case, literally glowing brighter with confidence. The course records, Mulvek continued with the enthusiasm of someone reading a tax code, currently stand at 18 hours, 43 minutes, set by the legendary Kuvathi champion Ultharam in the previous cycle. Gortham's chest swelled with pride at the mention of his predecessor. The pack had been dominating this competition for the better part of a decade, and he intended to keep that tradition alive. After all, what chance did a collection of inferior species have against beings literally bred for endurance hunting? Dr. Henthara, the medical official whose species looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a very concerned librarian, began her standard pre-race warnings. All competitors have been equipped with emergency beacons. Activation results in immediate disqualification, but ensures medical evacuation. The course claims an average of 30% of participants each cycle. 30%. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't just a race. It was a polite form of natural selection with a ribbon at the end. Vaughn raised his hand, and every eye, sensor, and optical organ turned to him. Question about the water stations. The collective groan from the other competitors could probably be heard from orbit. Water stations? Really? The human was worried about hydration? Gortham's lip curled in what might charitably be called a smile, but looked more like a preview of lunch. Water stations are located at kilometers 25, 75, 125, and 180, Dr. Henthara replied, with the patience of someone who'd clearly dealt with nervous rookies before. Vaughn nodded seriously and made a note on his wrist device. The other competitors exchanged glances that roughly translated to, "And this is why humans don't belong here." What they didn't know, what nobody knew, really, was that Vaughn had been asking about water stations for entirely different reasons than they assumed. While they saw weakness and over-preparation, he was calculating distance ratios, environmental factors, and strategic resource management. But then again, humans had always been underestimated, and Vaughn had learned long ago that being underestimated was often the best advantage of all. The starting horn, which sounded like a foghorn crossed with a death metal concert, echoed across the desert, and chaos erupted. The Kuvathi pack exploded forward as a coordinated unit, their powerful legs eating up ground with mechanical precision. Kethal moved with crystalline grace, each step perfectly calculated and efficient. Vorthix inflated himself slightly and began a strange rolling locomotion that looked ridiculous but was surprisingly effective. And Vaughn? Vaughn started jogging. Not running, not sprinting, not even particularly hustling. Just jogging. Like he was heading out for a pleasant morning constitutional around the neighborhood. Within the first kilometer, he was dead last, and the gap was widening by the minute. The spectators, various alien dignitaries and media representatives watching through environmental shields, began placing bets on how long the human would last before activating his emergency beacon. The over-under was set at 3 hours, and most of the smart money was on the under. "Perhaps the human has a strategy we don't understand," suggested one particularly optimistic commentator whose species was known for finding silver linings in supernovas. "Or perhaps," replied his more pragmatic colleague, "it simply doesn't understand the nature of the competition." As the pack of competitors disappeared over the first ridge, kicking up clouds of rust-colored dust, Vaughn maintained his steady pace. His breathing was controlled, his stride efficient, and his expression, well, his expression suggested he knew something the rest of them didn't, which, as it turned out, he absolutely did. The desert stretched ahead like a vast, unforgiving test. 200 kilometers of heat, hazards, and hubris. Most of the competitors saw it as a race to be won through speed and strength. Vaughn saw it as a problem to be solved through patience and planning. And problems, as any good engineer knows, always have solutions. You just have to be smart enough and stubborn enough to find them. The real question wasn't whether the human could keep up with beings literally evolved for this kind of punishment. The real question was whether any of them were prepared for what happened when a species that had climbed to the top of the food chain through sheer, bloody-minded persistence decided to show the galaxy what they were really made of. But that was still 199 kilometers away. For now, Vaughn just kept jogging, and the desert kept watching. And somewhere in the distance, a young Cuvati cub named Velka was about to learn that sometimes the greatest victories come from the most unexpected places. 8 hours into what could generously be called organized suffering, the Galactic Athletic Championship was living up to its reputation as the galaxy's most efficient method of separating the genuinely tough from the merely delusional. The scoreboard, if you could call the floating holographic display that tracked competitor positions a scoreboard, told a story that would have made a statistician weep. Of the original 42 participants, 31 were still moving. The other 11 had either triggered their emergency beacons or were currently being scraped off various portions of the landscape by medical teams who'd clearly seen this movie before. Leading the pack, naturally, were the Cuvati. Gortham maintained his position at the front, his silver-gray form cutting through the desert heat like a furry missile with anger management issues. His pack followed in formation, their coordination so precise it would have made a military drill sergeant shed a proud tear. Well, most of his pack. Young Velka was falling behind, and the gap was growing wider with each kilometer. His reddish-brown fur was matted with sweat and dust, his tongue lolling as he struggled to maintain the punishing pace set by his elders. The kid was giving it everything he had, but everything he had was starting to look like not quite enough. Meanwhile, in dead last place, and apparently unconcerned about it, Vaughn continued his methodical progress through what could only be described as nature's attempt to create the perfect murder weapon disguised as a landscape. "The human maintains its position," observed the lead commentator, whose species communicated primarily through bioluminescent patterns that roughly translated to, "I'm professionally obligated to sound interested in this slow-motion disaster." "Dead last is hardly a position worth maintaining," replied his colleague, whose own species had evolved from creatures that found entertainment in watching paint dry, so his standards for excitement were admittedly low. But here's where things got interesting. And by interesting, we mean the kind of interesting that makes you realize you've been watching the wrong movie this entire time. While the other competitors were busy being impressive and athletic, and generally proving their superiority through the time-honored tradition of going very fast in straight lines, Vaughn was doing something else entirely. He was learning. Every rocky outcropping, every shadow pattern, every shift in the wind, the human was cataloging it all with the methodical patience of someone who understood that information was often more valuable than speed. His environmental scanner wasn't just tracking his vitals, it was building a comprehensive map of terrain features, weather patterns, and resource locations. At the 30-kilometer mark, where the first water station squatted like a metallic oasis in an ocean of hostility, the real entertainment began. The crystalline Nexari, Keth Al, arrived first, which was mathematically predictable given their perfectly efficient stride and complete lack of what most species would recognize as physical limitations. They approached the water station with the confidence of someone who'd never met a problem they couldn't solve through superior engineering and crystal harmonics. That confidence lasted exactly as long as it took for the desert sun to hit their perfectly transparent body at precisely the wrong angle. The light refraction created a focused beam that turned Kethel into something resembling a walking laser pointer. Within minutes, hairline fractures began appearing across their crystalline structure. Nature's way of reminding everyone that even perfect beings have design flaws when you take them out of their intended environment. "This is unexpected," Kethal chimed, their harmonious voice developing distinctly discordant notes as stress fractures spread through their torso. The Kuavathi pack arrived at the water station to find the Nexari carefully positioning themselves in available shade, their previously flawless surface now resembling a stained glass window after an argument with a baseball. "Weakness," Gortham growled, though there was less satisfaction in his voice than there should have been. Even alpha predators occasionally experienced something resembling sympathy, particularly when watching someone else's day go comprehensively sideways. Velka, panting heavily as he struggled to keep up with his pack's drinking schedule, couldn't help but stare at the fracturing Nexari. There was something unsettling about watching a being who'd seemed invincible just hours earlier suddenly looking as fragile as spun glass in a paint mixer. The pack refueled and moved on, leaving Kethal to contemplate the philosophical implications of structural integrity versus ambient solar radiation. They would eventually continue, but their race was effectively over, a fact that wouldn't become apparent until the medical teams found them 3 hours later, carefully arranged in a pattern that minimized light exposure while maximizing their chances of not resembling a broken chandelier. 20 kilometers later, at the 50-kilometer mark, where the course took a sharp turn through a canyon system that looked like someone had taken a perfectly good landscape and hit it repeatedly with a geological sledgehammer, the Fluxy delegation encountered their own special variety of desert hospitality. Vorthix, who'd been making surprisingly good time with his inflated rolling technique, discovered that desert canyons have their own microclimate. Specifically, they discovered that these particular canyons had been designed by someone with a sense of humor and a degree in atmospheric engineering. The thin air at canyon elevation, combined with wind patterns that created natural vacuum pockets, meant that a being who relied on specific atmospheric gas concentrations was about to have what could politely be called a very bad time. Vorthix's first indication that things were going wrong came when his usual method of communication, expelling methane in meaningful patterns, stopped working because there wasn't enough atmospheric pressure to carry the gas effectively. His second indication came when his inflated body began deflating faster than a punctured balloon at a children's party. Within minutes, he was reduced to a deflated, gasping mess, flopping around the canyon floor like a particularly unathletic fish. His emergency beacon activated automatically when his vital signs hit critical levels, and the medical teams swooped in to collect another casualty of overconfidence meets environmental physics. "Another one bites the dust," the commentators noted, with the professional detachment of beings who'd learned not to get emotionally invested in individual competitors. The human, meanwhile, continues to maintain its unique pace. And that's when things got really interesting. Because, while everyone else was busy failing in spectacular fashion, Vaughn had reached the canyon system and was doing something that would have made a xenobiologist weep with professional joy. He was adapting. Instead of charging through the canyon like every other competitor, the human stopped at the entrance and spent a full 20 minutes just watching. studying the wind patterns, testing the air pressure, observing how sound carried differently in the thin atmosphere. Then he did something that would have seemed completely insane to any rational observer. He started collecting things. Scraps of metal from debris scattered throughout the canyon, fragments of crystalline formations that had broken off from the walls, even some of the methane residue that Vorthix had left behind during his undignified exit. "What is the human doing?" asked the lead commentator, whose professional obligation to maintain objectivity was being severely tested by what appeared to be a competitor having some sort of breakdown involving amateur geology. "It appears to be crafting," replied his colleague, whose species had a word for this behavior, though it roughly translated to pointless fidgeting undertaken by inferior minds. But it wasn't pointless fidgeting. It was engineering. Within 30 minutes, Vaughn had constructed a makeshift atmospheric processor from canyon debris. Nothing fancy, just a simple device that could concentrate the available gases and create a more breathable microenvironment. Then he'd fashioned a primitive but effective light refraction system using the crystalline fragments, creating shade patterns that hadn't existed before. And then, because humans are apparently incapable of doing anything without overthinking it, he left the devices behind for the next competitors to find. The first to benefit was a struggling competitor from the Vexani species, insectoid beings who'd been having their own atmospheric difficulties. They found Vaughn's improvised life support system and managed to recover enough to continue the race instead of joining the growing collection of emergency beacon activations. "The human helped them," observed the lead commentator, whose species didn't have a word for this concept and was struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. "Why would it sacrifice competitive advantage to assist rivals?" asked his colleague, whose entire worldview was apparently based on the assumption that all competition was zero-sum. "Because that's what humans do, you beautiful, naive alien observers. When faced with someone else's suffering, the human response isn't to calculate competitive advantage. It's to ask, 'How can I help?' and then figure out the logistics later." But the really interesting part was still coming. At the 80-kilometer mark, where the course left the canyon system and entered what the race organizers euphemistically called the thermal zone, but which was more accurately described as the part of the desert where the rocks are literally too hot to touch, and the air shimmers like it's having an existential crisis, young Velka finally hit his limit. The Kuvathi cub had been running on determination and teenage stubbornness for the past 20 kilometers, but biology eventually trumps willpower. His pace slowed to a stumble, then to a walk, then to a weaving, dangerous stagger that suggested his internal temperature regulation was losing the battle against Nexus Prime's relentless hostility. Gortham, torn between pack loyalty and race position, made the kind of calculation that alphas have been making since the concept of leadership was invented: the pack's overall success versus individual welfare. The math was brutal, but simple. Velka was slowing them down. The competition was still winnable, but only if they maintained their current pace. "Keep up, or fall behind," he growled over his shoulder, the words carrying the weight of evolutionary pragmatism and breaking the heart of every pack member who heard them. But sometimes evolution gets it wrong. Sometimes the real measure of a species isn't how well they abandon the weak. It's how far they'll go to carry them. Velka watched his pack disappear over the next ridge, their forms wavering in the heat haze like a mirage of everything he'd wanted to prove he could be. He stood there in the thermal zone, alone and failing, and for the first time in his young life, he understood what it meant to be truly abandoned. That's when he heard the footsteps. Steady, methodical, unhurried footsteps that belonged to the one competitor everyone had written off as a joke. The human who'd been dead last for 80 kilometers and showed no signs of caring about it. Vaughn appeared through the heat haze like some sort of desert apparition, still maintaining that same impossible pace, still looking like he was out for a casual stroll rather than participating in the galaxy's most brutal endurance competition. And when he saw the collapsed Kuvathi cub, he didn't hesitate, didn't calculate, didn't weigh competitive advantage against moral obligation. He just stopped running and started helping. Because that's what humans do. Hour 18 of the Galactic Athletic Championship brought with it the kind of weather that made meteorologists question their career choices, and race organizers check their insurance policies. The sandstorm hit the course like nature's own version of a blender, filled with glass shards and bad intentions. Nexus Prime's storms weren't the gentle romantic affairs you might see in a vacation hologram. These were full-scale atmospheric tantrums that could strip paint from starship hulls and turn visibility into a theoretical concept rather than a practical reality. Wind speeds topped 120 kilometers per hour, and the sand particles moved with the enthusiasm of projectiles fired from a particularly vindictive cannon. The remaining competitors, and at this point, remaining was doing some heavy lifting as a descriptor, scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Most took shelter wherever they could find it, behind rock formations, in shallow caves, or in the case of the more technologically advanced species, inside emergency shelters that deployed faster than you could say, "I should have stayed home." Gortham and his pack had found refuge in a natural windbreak formed by collapsed canyon walls, their superior senses allowing them to locate shelter before the worst of the storm hit. They huddled together, pack instincts overriding competitive drive, sharing body heat, and waiting for the atmospheric violence to exhaust itself. "Where's the cub?" asked Korthek, during a brief lull in the wind's screaming. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that speaks volumes, specifically, volumes about guilt, pragmatism, and the uncomfortable intersection between survival and morality. "He made his choice," Gortham growled, but there was something in his voice that suggested even alpha wolves occasionally experienced what lesser species might call doubt. Meanwhile, somewhere in the swirling chaos of sand and regret, two figures moved through the storm, with the determination of beings who'd apparently never learned the meaning of sensible shelter-seeking behavior. Vaughn, it turned out, had a few tricks up his sleeve that hadn't made it into the pre-race intelligence reports. Military engineering training included a comprehensive course in how to continue functioning when the environment is actively trying to murder you, and desert storm navigation fell squarely into that curriculum. He'd fashioned a makeshift breathing filter from torn fabric and debris, created improvised eye protection using reflective materials salvaged from earlier in the race, and was navigating by dead reckoning and an internal compass that would have impressed a carrier pigeon. But more importantly, he was carrying a semi-conscious Kuvathi cub who weighed approximately 60 kilograms and had all the cooperative instincts of a sack of particularly stubborn potatoes. "Stay with me, kid," Vaughn muttered through his makeshift filter, his voice barely audible over the wind's endless tantrum. "We're going to get through this, but I need you to keep breathing, all right?" Velka managed a weak whimper that might have been agreement, or might have been the sound of someone whose internal organs were having a heated discussion about whether to continue functioning. His fever had spiked during the storm, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. Classic signs of heat exhaustion progressing towards something much more serious. The human had done what he could with field medicine, improvised cooling using evaporative techniques, oral rehydration using carefully rationed water supplies, and constant monitoring of vital signs using equipment that was probably older than some of the civilizations represented in this race. But there's only so much you can do in the middle of a sandstorm when your patient is a species you've never treated before, and your medical supplies consist of whatever you can improvise from pocket contents and environmental debris. The storm raged for 3 hours during which most competitors lost valuable time, some lost their nerve, and a few lost consciousness, while their emergency beacons summoned medical evacuation teams who couldn't launch until the weather cleared. When the wind finally exhausted its fury and the sand settled into the kind of eerie calm that follows atmospheric violence, the desert revealed a landscape that had been thoroughly rearranged by nature's interior decorator. Dunes had shifted, landmarks had disappeared, and the course markers had been either buried or relocated to entirely different postal codes. Vaughn emerged from the storm's aftermath looking like he'd been personally disagreed with by every grain of sand on the planet. His improvised protective gear was shredded, his skin was abraded by wind-driven particles, and his water supplies were running dangerously low. But he was still moving, still carrying Velka, and still maintaining that impossible pace that had characterized his entire approach to this race. More importantly, he'd gained ground. Significant ground. While other competitors had lost hours to shelter and storm-related delays, the human had continued moving through conditions that should have been completely impassable. His position in the race had jumped from dead last to somewhere in the middle of the pack, a development that caused considerable consternation among the commentators and race officials who'd been treating his participation as comic relief. The human appears to have made substantial progress during the atmospheric disturbance, observed the lead commentator, whose bioluminescent patterns were flickering in confusion. This is irregular. Perhaps its inferior sensory systems prevented it from recognizing the danger, suggested his colleague, whose species had apparently evolved to find silver linings in acts of catastrophic stupidity. But the real surprise was still coming, because as the remaining competitors began emerging from their various shelters and assessing storm damage, they started encountering something unprecedented in Galactic Athletic Championship history: evidence of systematic assistance. At the 90-kilometer mark, where the course crossed a seasonal riverbed that the storm had turned into a temporary torrential death trap, someone had rigged an improvised bridge using debris and engineering principles that belonged in a textbook rather than a survival situation. At the 100-kilometer mark, where shifting sands had buried the official water station, someone had marked the location with improvised signals and even managed to excavate part of the facility. At the 110-kilometer mark, where the storm had created a field of unstable sand dunes that represented a navigation nightmare, someone had left trail markers indicating the safest route through terrain that changed configuration every time the wind shifted. The human, realized the first competitor to encounter these modifications, a member of the Zenthari species whose entire culture was built around individual achievement and personal glory. The human did this. Word spread among the remaining competitors with the speed of beings who were suddenly forced to recalculate their understanding of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a race anymore. This had become something entirely different. A demonstration of principles that most galactic civilizations had abandoned somewhere between developing interstellar travel and forgetting why they'd wanted to leave their home planets in the first place. The Kuvathi pack, upon emerging from their storm shelter, found themselves facing a navigation challenge that should have cost them hours of careful pathfinding. Instead, they found clearly marked routes, improvised safety measures, and evidence of someone who'd been thinking about group survival rather than individual victory. Who would do this? Korthek wondered aloud, his pack instincts recognizing altruistic behavior even when his competitive mindset couldn't process the motivation. Gortham studied the trail markers with the analytical eye of a predator who'd spent his entire life reading environmental signs. The construction techniques were crude but effective. The materials were improvised but intelligently selected. The placement showed an understanding of pack movement patterns that suggested significant observation and tactical thinking. "Someone who thinks differently than we do," he replied, and for the first time since the race began, there was something in his voice that might have been respect. That's when they found the medical station. At the 120-kilometer mark, where the official medical checkpoint had been completely buried by the storm, someone had established an improvised treatment facility using salvaged equipment and techniques that belonged in a trauma center rather than a desert survival situation. And staffing this improvised medical station was the human everyone had written off as a joke, currently engaged in what could only be described as performing miracles with inadequate resources and stubborn determination. Velka lay on an improvised medical bed, actually a stretcher constructed from race debris and fabric, while Vaughn worked with the focused intensity of someone who'd apparently forgotten that he was supposed to be running a race rather than operating a field hospital. The young Kuavati's condition had stabilized, but barely. His breathing was regular, his fever had broken, and his vital signs suggested someone who would live to see another day. But the medical intervention had clearly been touch and go for several hours. "You stopped," Gortham said, as he approached the medical station, his voice carrying a mixture of confusion and something that might have been awe. "You stopped racing to save him." Vaughn looked up from his patient, his face showing the kind of exhaustion that comes from hours of high-stress medical work under impossible conditions. His hands were steady, his eyes were clear, but everything else about him suggested someone operating on reserves that should have been depleted hours ago. "He needed help," Vaughn replied, as if this explained everything that needed explaining. "But the race will be here when he's stable." And that's when Gortham experienced something that alpha predators aren't supposed to experience: a complete recalibration of his understanding of what strength actually means. Because standing in front of him was a being who just demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond anything the Kuvati had witnessed in decades of athletic competition. This human had navigated a sandstorm that had stopped everyone else. He'd improvised medical equipment that was saving a life using techniques that suggested training and experience far beyond what anyone had expected. He'd built infrastructure that was helping every other competitor in the race. And he'd done it all while carrying a patient who weighed nearly as much as he did, and maintaining a pace that was starting to look less like desperation and more like carefully calculated strategy. You could win this, Gortham realized, his alpha instincts recognizing tactical superiority when they saw it. You could actually win this race. Vaughn checked Velka's pulse one more time, satisfied himself that the young Kuvathi would recover with rest and proper hydration, and then looked up at the pack, alpha with eyes that held depths. The wolf-like alien was only beginning to understand. Maybe, Vaughn admitted, but winning isn't always about crossing the finish line first. And, with that philosophical bomb dropped like a tactical nuke in the middle of everything Gortham thought he understood about competition, the human picked up his patient, gently, carefully, like he was carrying something precious rather than a competitor's pack member, and resumed his impossible pace toward the finish line. Behind him, he left a pack of predators who were suddenly questioning everything they thought they knew about strength, victory, and what it really meant to be the alpha of anything. The race wasn't over yet. There were still 80 kilometers of desert between the competitors and the finish line. But something fundamental had changed in those moments at the improvised medical station. The question was no longer who would win the Galactic Athletic Championship. The question was what winning actually meant, and whether any of them had been competing in the right race at all. The final 80 kilometers of the Galactic Athletic Championship became something the race organizers would be discussing in committee meetings for the next decade, assuming they could find words adequate to describe what they'd witnessed, which, frankly, seemed unlikely. Vaughn resumed his methodical pace with Velka, secured in an improvised carrying harness he'd constructed from race gear and determination. The young Kuvati was conscious now, though weak, and the reality of what was happening seemed to be filtering through his fever-addled consciousness, like sunlight through particularly stubborn clouds. You stopped for me," Velka managed between careful sips of rationed water. His voice carried the wonder of someone discovering that the universe operated on principles he'd never been taught. "Seemed like the right thing to do," Vaughn replied, adjusting the harness to distribute weight more evenly. His pace never faltered, his breathing remained controlled, and his stride maintained that same impossible efficiency that had characterized his entire approach to this nightmare of a race. Behind them, something unprecedented was happening. The remaining competitors, beings from species that had been competing against each other for territorial dominance since before humans had figured out fire, were forming what could only be described as a protective escort. Gortham led his pack alongside the human, their formation creating windbreaks and shade patterns that reduced environmental stress. Other competitors followed suit, their competitive instincts temporarily overwhelmed by something deeper and more fundamental: the recognition of genuine heroism in action. "This is highly irregular," observed the lead commentator, whose bioluminescent patterns were cycling through colors that roughly translated to professional confusion mixed with grudging admiration. "The competitors appear to be cooperating," replied his colleague, whose species had a term for this behavior, though it hadn't been used in competitive contexts for several thousand years. At the 160-kilometer mark, the race officials encountered their first real crisis of the day that didn't involve environmental hazards or medical emergencies. A formal complaint had been filed by representatives of the Nexari High Council, alleging that Vaughn's assistance to other competitors constituted unfair advantage through external intervention. The complaint was, technically speaking, completely ridiculous. Helping other competitors hardly qualified as gaining an unfair advantage, particularly when that help involved stopping your own forward progress to provide medical aid. But bureaucracy has never been known for its relationship with logic, and the officials found themselves facing a procedural nightmare. "The human must be disqualified," insisted the Nexari representative, whose crystalline structure was still showing stress fractures from his own encounter with desert physics. "The regulations clearly state that outside assistance results in immediate removal from competition." Dr. Henthara, who'd been monitoring the situation through medical tracking systems, found herself in the unusual position of having to explain basic ethics to beings who'd apparently evolved past the concept. The assistance was provided by a competitor to other competitors, she clarified, with the patience of someone who'd clearly dealt with bureaucratic nonsense before. There was no outside intervention. If anything, the human sacrificed competitive advantage to provide aid. Then he should be disqualified for not competing properly, the Nexari representative insisted, his harmonics reaching frequencies that suggested someone whose worldview was experiencing structural failure. That's when Gortham did something that would be remembered in Kuvati pack histories for generations to come. The Alpha Predator, leader of the most successful racing pack in galactic history, stepped forward and addressed the race officials with the kind of authority that comes from never having had his competence questioned. Any attempt to disqualify the human will result in the immediate withdrawal of all Kuvathi competitors, he announced, his voice carrying the finality of continental drift. This being has demonstrated capabilities and character that exceed any competitor in championship history. He will be allowed to complete the race. The other competitors, even those who'd been struggling with their own understanding of what they were witnessing, found themselves nodding in agreement. When a Kuvathi Alpha declares something, lesser beings tend to pay attention, particularly when that declaration is backed by observable evidence of extraordinary competence. Motion seconded by all remaining competitors, announced Korthek, speaking for beings who were discovering that unity could emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. The officials, faced with the choice between bureaucratic rigidity and universal competitor revolt, chose the path of least resistance. The race would continue under existing regulations, which technically didn't prohibit altruistic behavior, mainly because the concept had never occurred to anyone as a possibility worth regulating. The final 20 kilometers became a procession unlike anything in galactic athletic history. Vaughn maintained his carrying pace, Velka recovered enough to provide navigation assistance, and the remaining competitors formed an honor guard that protected both from environmental hazards and bureaucratic interference. "You know," Velka said during one of their brief rest stops, "my pack will never believe this happened." "They'll believe it," Gortham interjected, his voice carrying the weight of personal transformation. "Because they'll see the recording, and because I'll tell them what I witnessed here." "What did you witness?" Vaughn asked, genuinely curious about the Alpha's perspective on events. Gortham studied the human with eyes that had spent a lifetime evaluating strength, competence, and pack worthiness. What he saw challenged every assumption his species had developed about power and leadership. "I witnessed someone who could have won this race in half the time," he said slowly, choosing instead to redefine what victory means. And that's when the final revelation hit everyone like a tactical surprise delivered with surgical precision. Vaughn's dead last performance for the first 80 kilometers hadn't been due to inadequate preparation or insufficient capability. It had been strategic, deliberate, calculated. He'd been studying the course, learning the environmental challenges, observing other competitors' strengths and weaknesses, and preparing for contingencies that no one else had even considered. His engineering background hadn't just given him survival skills, it had given him the ability to see the entire race as a systems problem rather than a simple endurance test. "You could have won," Gortham repeated, this time with the finality of absolute certainty. "Maybe," Vaughn acknowledged, "but what would that have proven? That humans can run fast? That we can endure punishment? That we can outcompete other species through superior physical performance?" The assembled competitors listened with the attention of beings who were learning something fundamental about the species they'd dismissed as weak and irrelevant. "Or," Vaughn continued, his pace never wavering as they approached the final kilometers, "I could demonstrate something more important. That humans define strength differently. That our greatest victories come not from defeating others, but from lifting them up. That the measure of a species isn't how well they abandon the weak, but how far they'll carry them." The finish line appeared through the heat haze like a mirage of completion and bureaucratic relief. Vaughn crossed it, dead last in terms of raw time, carrying a competitor from a rival species, surrounded by beings who'd started the race seeing him as inferior and ended it recognizing something approaching reverence. The ceremony that followed would be talked about for generations. Gortham, alpha of the most dominant racing pack in galactic history, approached the human who'd redefined everything the competition thought it understood about strength and victory. And then, in front of representatives from dozens of galactic civilizations, he lowered his head in a gesture of respect that hadn't been offered to a non-Kuvathi in living memory. "The pack acknowledges the human," he announced, his voice carrying across the desert silence. "You have shown us what true strength looks like." The other competitors followed suit, each offering gestures of respect according to their species' traditions. What had begun as a competition to determine physical superiority had become something unprecedented. A galaxy-wide recognition that humanity brought something unique to the cosmic community. Not dominance, not superiority, but compassion backed by competence, and the revolutionary idea that the strongest victories are the ones that lift everyone higher. Vaughn accepted their respect with the quiet dignity of someone who'd never been competing for recognition in the first place. He'd come to prove a point about human capabilities. He'd ended up proving something far more important about human character. And somewhere in the celebration that followed, young Velka learned the most important lesson of his life: that sometimes the greatest winners are the ones who redefine what winning means, and that strength isn't about how fast you can run. It's about how far you're willing to carry others when they can't run at all.